Actually, I had no idea that the spray was happening at all. You know, I was totally oblivious to it, like a lot of people. And I was down at Elkhorn Slough, and Elkhorn Slough is a native bird sanctuary here, right down south of Watsonville. And I was just checking out plants along the side of the road and down into the slough, and I was just flabbergasted with what I saw. There was an area of about 30 yards long, and just in this short area, there were 29 dead cormorants, just all strewn about the rocks. And I thought in my head, what could have possibly killed these birds? Because they were all in pristine condition, not eaten by maggots. They hadn't been there for months. They had like all died around the same time, you know, looking at the condition of their bodies, and they were pliable, and I just couldn't understand what could have done this. And that was about 2 weeks after the last Monterey spray. And then the Santa Cruz spray happened. And as soon as I got the day after the Santa Cruz spray, my eyes were itchy, my throat was scratchy. And I'm wondering, gee, I wonder if it was the spray that's causing these symptoms. And then I read an article in the Monterey paper that said that there was a peculiar, you know, scratchy eyes and itchy throat that people experience in Monterey. And I said, well, son of a gun, it probably is the spray. But I still didn't really care. But then 2 days later, the local papers here started talking about finding hundreds of dead seabirds along the coast, which started immediately the day after the spray. And I said, son of a gun, there has to be a connection between this, the symptoms, and me seeing these dead birds in Elkhorn Slough after the Monterey spray. So that's what got me involved in this issue, and I've spent the last, literally since November, 10, 12, 14 hours a day completely focused on learning everything I can about every aspect of the spray, and especially the environmental and the health aspects. And that's what I focus on now.
Have you been having people come to you for relief of their symptoms or help to detoxify?
A lot of people ask, because of my background in herbal medicine. A lot of people do ask, what can I do either to prepare for the next spray, and what can I do to help detoxify? That's not my focus. My focus is stopping the spray. I don't want this to happen again, either to land or to people, so I'm going to do everything I can to stop this. Probably the most basic thing is that the justification for calling this an emergency and actually needing to eradicate this moth seems to be smokes and mirrors and a paper house, so to speak. Doesn't have a lot of fundamental justification. CDFA and USDA put out a lot of facts and figures as to what might occur as far as negative impact on agriculture, but this doesn't seem to be the case in those countries where LBAM is naturalized. Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, United Kingdom. LBAM, the light brown apple moth, is not a significant pest from an economic perspective. It is from an economic perspective due to quarantine restrictions that are imposed by the United States, but actual crop damage, there's very little to none in any of those countries occurring because of LBAM. The California folks also say that the LBAM has the potential to negatively affect native plants in the wild, pines, cypresses, redwoods, things like that. And that's, again, smokes and mirrors, complete fallacy. There's, again, no place in the world where LBAM is naturalized for the last few hundred years has any damage to native habitat really occurred, any significance whatsoever. So a lot of the basic fundamental premise for this emergency is false. The second one is that the moth can be eradicated. There's numerous experts, most notably Professor Jim Carey from UC Davis, professor of entomology and a specialist in invasion biology of pests. Very strongly and clearly states that it's been here too long. The populations are too developed to be eradicated. Even if you used really strong pesticides, you're still not going to eradicate this population. And so that we have to move away from eradication into what's called integrated pest management, i.e. a holistic program for dealing with pests. And central to that are healthy ecosystems that maintain a healthy population of beneficial predators that will naturally control the moth and the moth eggs and things like that, and that's what happens in other countries. That is Professor Carey's position, that when you have a moth, that a population of any pest that spans 7,000 square miles, you're talking from Sonoma down to Los Angeles, that's such an extensive population that it had to have been here for decades. It just doesn't happen like that overnight. Populations don't get established overnight. You can have single moths be coming into the country through plants or agricultural products, shipments, things like that. But those are sporadic. Those don't create a population typically. It takes many generations of that moth to actually develop distinct populations. And we have distinct populations, like I said, from Sonoma down into Los Angeles, 7,000 square miles. That means it's likely been here for decades if you follow the modeling of how long it takes for a pest that has a lifespan of 2 to 3 months to get to, you know, several thousand or tens of thousands of actual moths.
So has it proven itself as a pest?
Not at all. As far as everything that CDFA, California Department of Food and Agriculture, says is that there has been no damage whatsoever in agriculture or in native plants. There's been none seen whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now, you guys really exhausted all your remedies. You got a TRO, you got had lawsuits going on, but it failed to stop the spraying. What have you learned that other people on their list, you know, can benefit from in terms of organizing?
Oh, we haven't even begun to exhaust our options. Those were just the immediate stopgap things to try to get a temporary restraining order and have the lawsuits in, and we'll see what the outcome of those will be. But no, we haven't even begun to exhaust the options. So, for example, one is petitioning the governor. He's gotten a lot of letters, he's gotten a lot of phone calls. Nobody's really sat down and said, we need you to listen to this story, to the whole story, and really lay it out. Same thing with our state and federal Congress people, which is happening now, you know, in the form of resolutions and public hearings. Next week there's probably going to be 3 congressional hearings, state you know, representative hearings on this issue. So there's a lot of activity there. The USDA outlines conditions that provide justification for the termination of an emergency program, and that's what I'm focused on now, is building the case that we've already met that justification. One of the primary conditions that has to be met is socio-political opposition, and we've clearly reached the benchmark of socio-political opposition in that we have 3 lawsuits, we have 7 resolutions, we have potential other lawsuits, we have 10,000 signatures on petitions opposing the spray, we have congressional hearings, we have extreme, we got activist groups popping up in Marin when this hasn't even been sprayed yet, and in Berkeley and San Francisco. So we have, I believe, the justification on socio-political grounds already. On the health side of things, this is another area where I've focused on, both on the human health side and the environmental side. In the first case, the environmental, because I got pulled in by the birds. Now, to date, within 1 week of the spray, there was a reported, and this is conservative, 750 dead seabirds found along the coastline here, right in the general area within the spray zone. That's appalling. First, the newspapers wrote about the birds being covered in a yellow sticky substance, and that the oil from the feathers was stripped away so that they drowned. They basically couldn't maintain their buoyancy, and they drowned, were starving, were freezing cold. That's why they died. Which makes sense as the birds that I saw. Again, no injuries, no nothing, just dead and obviously drowned. The day after the spray, we got sprayed the first time on Thursday night, and then on Friday, and again Friday, and then it rained, a small rain Friday, and then a big rain on Saturday. people that were walking down the beach on the Saturday saw yellow gunk coming out of the drain pipes that feed into Monterey Bay. And then there was a long swath of thick yellow foam, a mile and a half long, 70 feet deep, and a foot thick on top of the water at West Cliff Beach. Yellow gunky stuff that was under the boardwalk. It was at pump houses that pump out rivers and stuff like that. So this stuff was clearly coming from the land and falling into and flowing into the bay. We have beautiful photographs of it, and nobody at that time tested this material that we know of. This is an environmental consequence that completely went paid attention to, for example. And then other people were reporting this yellow gunk washing down the windows from the rain, or on their cars, or filling up planter boxes. We have one kid whose kayak was in his backyard on the west side of Santa Cruz, and that filled up with water, and the same yellow gunky stuff filled his kayak. It took him 2.5 hours to clean it out. I actually have a bottle of the liquid that he cleaned out in my refrigerator, but it's several months old now. But again, nobody tested this material as to what it could be. But again, we know that it came from the air, because otherwise it wouldn't have been in the kayak, the planter boxes on people's windows, on their cars. And it's the same yellow gunky stuff that went into the bay, same thing that covered the water, same thing that was found on the birds. And so this is an environmental issue that was never even addressed by the state or the feds or any organization that I know of whatsoever. So first they said the birds were covered with this yellow stuff. And they said they identified it as a surfactant. Well, there's a surfactant, tricapryl methylammonium chloride. That's an ingredient in the pesticide, Checkmate, that was used in the spray. Then they said there isn't any surfactant in the Checkmate. This is what the CDFA continues to allege today, that there's no surfactant. And I have 2 peer-reviewed papers that say this stuff is a surfactant. And so first, the birds were covered with yellow gunk. Then they said it was probably due to a surfactant. Then they said that the birds probably died of red tide. And then they said there was a mystery spill. And then they said it wasn't red tide, but a protein that was anomalously associated with red tide. And it went on, and we never got a definitive as to what caused the death of these birds. And as of last week, I was at a CDFA Environmental Advisory Task Force meeting. And they had the state toxicologist from Fish and Wildlife call in, and they still haven't released a report. But CDFA continues to assert that the spray had nothing to do with the death of the birds, even though they've never received a report as to what the cause of death was. So this disturbs me, that they can go in first, misrepresent that the material doesn't contain a surfactant when it does, and not acknowledge any connection when the birds started dying literally the morning after the spray. Not within 1 day or 2 days or 5 days, but immediately after the spray. And we got sprayed Thursday night. People were walking their dogs, taking their beach walk on Friday, collecting injured and dead birds. So this is a temporal association directly associated with the spray. The yellow gunk, the stuff on cars and planter box on windows it's not a coincidence in my mind. So that's on the second environmental thing of significance is on the bee side of things. A woman heard me tell a bird story at the town hall meeting here in Santa Cruz, and I got a call the next day say, has anybody told you anything about the bees? I said, no, I haven't heard anything. And over the next week I got 4 other calls all saying, are you guys talking about the birds? I want to tell you about the bees. This first woman, she was gardening on Thursday, nice day out, and bees were just covering our rosemary bushes and stuff, and everything was normal. Friday, the morning after the spray, not a single bee anywhere to be found in her yard. Same type of weather, similar day, temperature-wise, sunny-wise, normal for the bees to be there. Absolutely no bees. Another week later, another woman talks to me, calls me, says, "My rose, I was in my garden the day after Friday, day after the spray, and the bees were there, but they were bumping in to the bush. it's like they couldn't find the flowers, that they were all disrupted. Some just not able to fly straight and literally floundering on the ground. And as I looked into that, the spray is delivered in a microencapsulation plastic bead that's made up of emulsifiers, surfactants, the pesticide itself, the pheromone pesticide itself, and plastic resin. So think about, if you got sprayed, if you're a little bee and you got sprayed with billions of tiny plastic, sticky, resiny microcapsules that stick all over your body, how well are you going to be able to fly? And when you look at the economic potential damage associated with agriculture that require bees, it dwarfs the amount of economic damage that they say is associated with the moth. It's a third of the world's world food supply depends on bees to pollinate. And it's literally in the tens of billions of dollars that bees are directly associated with the agricultural industry in the state of California. Tens of billions. And they're claiming a potential worst case loss of $133 million due to LBAM. The math doesn't work. You have to preserve the bees. Even if you're not directly toxifying it, just weighing them down with sticky, resinous beads. The micron size, exact same size as pollen grains. Pollen grains range from 10 to 125 microns in diameter. These are 10 to 190. And so then the last few days I've been going into the literature looking at pollen and the effect of microcapsules on hives. They carry them back to the hives. And the microcapsules are designed to release the toxins slowly, right? And these ones over a period of 30 to 90 days. So these poor guys, women actually, the worker bees, female worker bees, honeybees, are carrying back these microcapsules to the hive and feeding it to the queen, to the brood, to the immature, bees. And this is what's going to wipe them out. And we already have this severe situation with colony collapse all over the world. Bee colonies are collapsing, and literally a third of the world's food supply depends on bees, depends on pollinators, and the honeybees are associated with 90% of that pollination. So you tell me where the real damage lies. Is it with a moth that is a myth of mass destruction, or is it with us really wiping out the bees? I mean, this is a bigger problem that they ever dreamed of. But the point there is, because they never did an environmental impact review, there's no way they have no idea of what it'll do to birds, what it'll do to bees, what it'll do to beneficial predators that are needed to keep the moth at bay in a normal ecosystem, or what it will do to marine life. The Monterey Bay is a nationally protected marine sanctuary, and there hasn't been any environmental impact review. It's being done now, but it's a day late and a dollar short, in my opinion. So that's on the environmental bird and bee sides that hasn't even been looked at. And then you have the human adverse effects. As I said, for me, I had scratchy eyes, scratchy throat, no big deal. I deal with flus, I deal with colds without resorting to drugs. I just power through them. It's not a big deal to me. But when you hear about a 13-month-old boy in Monterey having a primary asthmatic attack and almost dying. I mean, a primary asthmatic attack means they've never had an asthmatic attack before. And almost dying, that's a little much. We have two other kids here, an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old here in Santa Cruz County, both of whom suffered primary anaphylaxis or asthmatic attacks the night of the spray. I have another absolutely heart-wrenching story from a dear friend who moved with her 5-year-old boy, who literally just freaked out all night long because of the dive-bombing planes continually coming over the house. And, "Mommy, what are they doing? Mommy, what are they doing? Are they hurting us?" And she did her best to comfort him, and she finally, you know, she said that, you know, we fell into a slumber at 4 o'clock in the morning, you know, after this poor kid just freaking out over the planes. So that has nothing to do with the spray, it has nothing to do with the microcapsules, it has nothing to do with the toxic ingredients in the spray itself. It just has to do with the fear and the stress and anxiety that it causes, not just children, but everybody. So then when you look at the reports, the health reports that were made, and the organization Hope in Monterey gathered up the majority of these health reports because there wasn't any other mechanism. The state had no mechanism that was effective for gathering such reports. Physicians weren't trained how to recognize the pesticide-related toxic event. So we had to do it ourselves, and Hope took the lead in doing this, an organization in Monterey. And they collected 643 reports, and amounting to more than 1,000 adverse people adversely affected, because each report, like one report might say, my whole family of 4 experienced respiratory disturbance or mucous membrane irritation or skin rash. But that was only counted as one. So there's a number out there that there were 643 adverse events. There were 643 reports with more than 1,000 adverse events. Individuals experience an adverse event, and many individuals experiencing more than one adverse event, like eye irritation, throat irritation, respiratory disturbance, skin rash. So one person might have experienced 3 or 4 different effects. So we're talking more than 1,000 people experiencing a negative effect, with experiencing up to 4,000 different negative effects. So that's a lot. So what I did with that is I went into the toxicological literature and looked at every ingredient that was in the Checkmate solution, which is predominantly consisting of the pheromone is only like 13 or 14% of the formula, and then the 86 other percent is other ingredients, which includes water, urea, this surfactant material, the tricaprol methylammonium chloride, and several other ingredients. There's about 10 ingredients in this pesticide cocktail solution. And when you look at all of the ingredients, their formal toxicological literature from the Environmental Protection Agency, USDA, from what are called MSDS sheets, material safety data sheets. These are the formal documents that people need in order to handle this stuff safely. From the direct toxicological literature, the compounds have potential teratogenic effects, mutagenic effects, carcinogenic effects, hormonal disruption, hepatotoxicity, respiratory disturbances, and skin rashes are all over the map, are all over the literature with regards to each of the ingredients in this. And that's not even talking about the microcapsules causing respiratory problems. This is just the gross toxicity of these things. Extremely toxic to bees, extremely toxic to marine ecologies, mollusks, salamanders, things like that. And all of the human adverse effects that were reported are completely consistent with what you would predictably observe upon exposure of these ingredients. It's not like the ingredients cause completely different classes of symptoms that you would expect. The same exact symptoms you would expect are the exact same symptoms that people experience. It's a one-to-one ratio. It's a direct correlation. It's not, you know, this is not extrapolation. This is real toxicological exposure. So then you get to the microcapsule delivery system. So first the state alleges this is a pheromone, so it's safe, but they don't talk about the quote-unquote inert ingredients, which are not inert. Many times inert ingredients are the most toxic within pesticides. But then the microcapsule delivery system, as I said, they're little beads, and they range from, the state originally said that they range from a 25 micron particle size up to a few hundred micron size. And so because of that, their documentation of the safety of this material says we did not perform respiratory studies because the micron size is too large to get through the bronchioles and into the bloodstream and to cause any problem. Then they did a study, a water aquatic ecology safety study that was sponsored by CDFA and conducted by UC Davis. And those researchers said that the micron particle size ranged from 10 microns to 190 microns. Well, at 10 microns, the American Lung Association classifies that as particulate pollution that can get directly into the lungs, and regardless of the content of the microcapsule, can cause asthma, emphysema, anaphylaxis, respiratory irritation, and death. And death. That's what they say. That's what their own documentation says. And they said even at the 25 micron size, respiratory disturbances such as were reported in these health adverse effects are plausible. But yet the state continues to say, no, these adverse effects had nothing to do with the spray. The spray is completely safe. Don't worry about it. And they've never yet conducted a respiratory study on this. They've never conducted a study on as far as whether or not this could cause mucous membrane irritation in all the people that had scratchy eyes, throats, and nose and things like that. And they continue to disregard all of these adverse effects that have been reported. And to me, that's bordering on criminal negligence.
What do you have you found is the real motivation for doing this insanity? And
have you followed the money, in other words?
In a bunch of different ways. There's some that want to make an insidious conspiratorial case against the manufacturers of the Checkmate solution, Suterra, Stuart Resnick and his wife, and because they're the biggest citrus producer in the world, and part of this issue has to do with trade equilibrium, and it's all about trade equilibrium. And at some point in time, classifying this moth probably gave the U.S. and by extension California and by extension the Resnicks a trade advantage in quarantining New Zealand and Australia, produce, probably citrus, and keeping it out of the European Union and keeping it out of Mexico and Canada. So it probably at one point in time gave us a great trade advantage. It might not give us the same trade advantage now. I'm not sure about that. But I don't think that's necessarily really the fundamental underpinning. They also will point to the fact that the Resnicks, gave $142,000 to the Schwarzenegger campaign and is one of the top 10 contributors to Schwarzenegger. But again, in my mind, everybody pays every governor. Every agricultural producer is going to pay every governor whatever they have in order to get an audience with them. So that's the American way, for better or worse. I think it's more basic than that. A number of us met with staff of CDFA 2 weeks ago, and they showed us a list of 94 eradication programs that they've engaged in over the last 20 years, which includes medfly and glassy wing sharpshooter and different things like that. And what happens when you have an emergency program that requires for pests to be eradicated, that's contingent upon the state. It's the responsibility of the state to carry the burden for that financially. And so it kicks them into an emergency mode where now they have access to funds that wouldn't normally be accessible to them for budgetary purposes. They can go into state emergency funds and then go into federal emergency funds. In this case, this was a USDA mandated program, and USDA put up $15 million. The state of California put up $2 million in emergency funds. Then an additional $75 million was approved for under the emergency from USDA to give to California to implement this program. I think it's a basic floating of your budget. If you have, if you follow the money with regards to programs that have been cut back because of all the money that's going to Iraq and how that gets all tied up, and that everybody gets their budgets slashed, this is a great way to float your agency and organization to keep it going. But they've been in this process of getting extra money for 20 years. As soon as it moves out of the eradication mode and out of emergency mode, no more funds, emergency funds, are available to use, because now it goes from emergency into integrated pest management and control. Those costs are the responsibility of the agricultural producers to bear, not the state. So I think that's the fundamental principle. The more eradication programs you have going in a revolving cyclical year after year, the more access you have to emergency money, which supports your organization. I think that's the fundamental basis of this.
What about the feds saying if the state won't do it, that they will?
That is their stance, because they, in their mind, this is the moth of mass destruction, and they have to go after it with great guns. Again, superficially, to satisfy trade barriers and requirements and maintain trade equilibrium. But I contacted the Agricultural Department in Canada, because the state of California and the USDA allege we have to satisfy our trade partners in Mexico and Canada. Well, again, if you follow politics and you follow anything about trade at all, Canada and Mexico mostly follow U.S. standards. They don't have their own standards. They do what the U.S. does. And I contacted them directly and said, what was the basis of you establishing LBAM as a quarantinable or objectionable pest? They answered back directly, same week. We don't consider LBAM to be a problem, a significant problem in crops. Our primary motivation for classifying LBAM as a quarantinable pest is to be able to export into the United States and meet U.S. quarantine requirements. Mexico, I guarantee you, is the same way, because they don't have the ability to really classify their own pests. And Japan is another country that has a quarantine against LBAM. Well, they quarantine everything, and they're really afraid of superficial leaf rollers like LBAM is, because they have leaf rollers that go after tea, for example, and that's a major export for them. So Japan is probably its own entity, but Canada and Mexico clearly follow the U.S. and only impose these quarantine restrictions because they have to meet that for USDA imports. We've been trying to find out who started it, and the mayor of Albany did an op-ed piece 2 days ago, great op-ed piece, scathing op-ed piece against the state's program, and clearly stated, he says, I've looked for all the history on what started this and I can't find it. I couldn't find it either. I have a guy that goes to the Ag Library, National Agricultural Library in Maryland, almost on a daily basis. He can't find it. I contacted the librarian at the National Ag Library. She couldn't find the historical information that first classified LBAM as a, actionable or an objectionable pest. And usually what you'd have to do, somebody would have to go to the agency and said, we believe that this is a pest that requires an action, quarantine restrictions or whatever, and they would have to provide data supporting their position. That would have to be reviewed. That has to live in a docket or a file somewhere, and nobody can find it, so we don't know the origin of the classification. There's no record that we can find of anybody, any signature from the governor or the governor's office, other than a deputy director of the California Department of Food and Agriculture who presumably signed and declared this emergency. In point of fact, the state legislature passed a bill about supporting an eradication program against LBAM. And they discussed the language of whether they should call it an emergency or whether they should call it an urgent need. And they really debated this on the floor, and they specifically took emergency language out of the legislation and said this requires urgent attention. But they didn't say that this required an emergency declaration, because an emergency declaration basically puts you into martial law. It basically says the people have no right to do anything about this. That this is and Steve Lyle of CDFA stated that this is not a vote of the people. The authority lies with the state. That's specifically what they said, and that's a fact under emergency declaration. So he's not wrong. It might be morally wrong, but not legally incorrect. And so there was no governor seal of an emergency declaration. One of the pieces of legislation that we're proposing is calling for the governor to be required, be the only one authorized to declare an emergency. Because if you have it at least laying with the legislature, then you have legislative recourse. But if you have an emergency able to be declared by a deputy director, not even the director, the executive director of the CDFA, the secretary, but a deputy director, we feel that's a big problem. Here's what my proposal is, and it's not just mine, but several people, is that in the event that an emergency declaration is called, or prior to an emergency declaration of call, there's a host of us who are saying that we need to have a centralized scientific committee of the UC system experts to weigh in on, one, whether the emergency is really needed, two, whether the program that's being considered is going to work, and three, whether or not, what the steps should be. So that puts science in front of policy. Right now, policy is in front of science. And the reason we call for like a centralized committee is because in this case, and in all eradication cases, what CDFA does is they convene an ad hoc committee. They said, okay, we're going to take an expert from here, and from here. We're going to sit them down in the room. We're going to tell them really what we want them to do. We're going to get feedback from them, and then we're going to develop our program. And that's what they did. That allows them to cherry pick who they want, what programs they want to impose, and who they're going to get a sign-off from. That's what it is now. It's an ad hoc committee. If you have a UC-wide system where you have, somebody from this school, UC Davis, UC Riverside, UCSC, however the makeup is, but you have an intercollegiate review panel that doesn't work for CDFA, but represents the state of California, larger state of California, to look at environmental issues, to look at civil issues, to look at health issues, to look at environmental issues, not just a rubber stamp committee, but a committee that's an inter-university, interdisciplinary committee that would then give expert advice as to what kind of program should be imposed. If that had happened on this would probably not have happened, because they would have had guys like a James Carey, who is a preeminent expert in this area, saying, guys, the thing's been here too long, you're not going to eradicate it. You would have had a health expert say, hey guys, you can't do this without environmental impact reviews. You can't do this without appropriate studies to show that it's going to be safe for these people. You can't do this with no safety studies. They would have had a civil rights or a civics representative saying, this might represent a violation of California Constitution, so you can't do this. That's our ideal. We well know the government doesn't work the way it's supposed to work, but you either have to do that or you have to overthrow the system and start your own, and then you're going to create a whole new set of problems. So you either work with what you got, do the best you can, or you go into anarchy. And some people will choose the latter, but that's up to every individual's choice. My gut feeling is that it ain't going to happen in Marin. My gut feeling is these guys are toast and they just don't know it yet. And that we've already beaten them and just we haven't told them that yet. And over the next month and a half will determine how hard of a blow we can really deliver. Because it took us 4 to 5 months to get educated about this issue. We're not entomologists, we're not biologists, we're just normal people that were concerned with our lives, the lives of our children, the animals that share this area, and the environment. And we're in Santa Cruz. That's why we live here. That's who we are. Same with Marin or Bolinas especially, of course. So my gut feeling says they're toast and they just don't know it yet.
What's going to happen in this next month and a half that you think will be the final?
We'll put in our formal petitions. Right now they've gotten phone calls, they've gotten petitions, they've gotten postcards and form letters and a few meetings here or there. But we haven't, it took us 5 to 6 months to learn about this issue to a degree where we can speak about it intelligently and give practical reasons why this eradication program is a bad and unnecessary program. We sent 2 guys to New Zealand. We've counseled with leading entomologists on both sides of the issue, those that support and those that are against. We've attended the environmental advisory task force meetings of CDFA and every public meeting that we possibly could attend to learn as much as we possibly can. Now is to get all of it on paper and deliver it in the form of a formal petition to USDA, CDFA, Secretary of the Interior, congressional representatives both on the state and the federal level, and formally petition for the reversal of this emergency declaration and a complete discontinuation of the eradication program. We've told them we don't like it. We've told them we want them to stop, but we haven't given them the data that they need in order to say, hey, these guys really have the information together and we think they're right. And I believe that anybody that looks at the information that we've put together will agree.
Would, if they admit that you're right, will that put them in any jeopardy or vulnerability for lawsuits based on the harm that they've already done?
Good question. I don't know if that's true or not. Probably not, because they're not necessarily going to say that everything we said is right. Meaning they probably would not admit that the 1,000+ adverse effects and near fatality of a child was their fault, because that would make them ripe for a lawsuit. So they probably wouldn't acknowledge that. What they would probably acknowledge is that the conditions associated with justification for termination of an emergency program have been met, and that would be sufficient, and that would not be admitting that any wrongdoing on their part. It's actually a very elegant and procedural way out of this that doesn't put them at increased legal jeopardy, in my opinion. That's all they would need to say. You guys have met the standards or conditions of termination, so we terminate this eradication program and has to move to control and call it a day.
So the timeline is you're going to be complete with that process yourself in a month and a half, and then it goes
No, I think that, no, we're shooting for having completion and submission of the first document by March 18th, which is the formal delivery time for the USDA's Environmental Impact Review notification. What that means, the USDA published notification of an environmental impact review that they're conducting, and in putting this out as a notification, they say, you, the public, have to tell us what you want us to look for, what questions you want us to ask. They're going to get a heck of a lot more than they bargained for, and they have to address all of the questions that we asked by law, and they have to answer those questions. And they're going to be questions about health. They're going to be questions about the environmental impact. They're going to be questions about the birds that they're not going to be able to just kind of slough off as saying, oh no, the birds died because of red tide, according to one guy in the state or something like that. They're going to have to produce data that establishes their position. If we submit that information, those requests, along with the formal petitions showing that we've met the conditions for termination of the program, that should be sufficient. And again, it gives them an elegant way out. It gives them a non-controversial way out, other than the fact that they say, oh shoot, we have to deal with this moth now. But everything we've learned from New Zealand is that this moth is not a major pest of economic significance in Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, or the United Kingdom. It's only because the USDA makes everybody make sure that there's no LBAM anything in any shipment that comes into the US. That's the only reason it's any economic significance whatsoever. It's not because of the moth itself.
Why did it just show up? I mean, did you ever wonder, well, okay, so it's been here for a long time, and this regulation against it has been on the books for a while, right?
Yes.
So why now?
Supposedly, according to the state, they never identified it as being in the U.S., as a population being in the U.S. They've had fines, 100 or 74 fines positive finds where they see the moth like at an airport or in a shipment or something like that of produce. But they never saw, according to them, they never saw evidence of a population until it was found by this guy, Jerry Powell, in 2005, originally in Berkeley. Jerry's a past state entomologist and a real bug aficionado. So he has traps all over his backyard. So he just does it for fun. And he found this moth and said, geez, that looks like that moth that I looked at 20 years ago in Australia. You know, that's supposed to be a big problem. And he sent it to Australia for identification, and it came back confirmed LBAM, light brown apple moth. But he didn't tell the state at that time. And he just kept his traps out, and a year later he found another one, got another find, and this time, and again he sent that positive finding, and this time he told the state. And this is what stimulated all this. And then the state started doing trapping all over the state, you know, in Los Angeles, Sonoma, and to try to find out, well, where are these populations existing? And they said that before that they'd never found any, even though they've been doing cyclical trapping. But again, I think this is a little bit of smokes and mirrors in hindsight. That's not quite 2020. Is that the light brown apple moth is very similar morphologically, physically, to native brown moths that are common here. They were probably catching LBAMs for years, but just thought, oh, this is the regular brown moth. These don't do anything. Don't worry about it, because we have like 80 species of these moths that don't do anything to anything in the wild or into agriculture, that have no economic significance whatsoever. They're just part of the ecosystem. They're bird food, they're spider food, they're food for earwigs and flies and viruses and things like that. They do nothing to the ecosystem except act as a food supply. And so they probably were catching them for years and just didn't recognize them. Because when they first started catching, and where they first got flagged that LBAM might be here, they had to send them off. It would take them 2.5, 3 weeks to figure out if it was really an LBAM by looking at the genitalia, you know, under a microscope. And eventually they had to just go to genetic testing. So that shows how difficult it is to distinguish these from native moths. So they were probably here. They were probably catching them forever, and they just didn't recognize them as LBAM. And at that time, they were part of the ecosystem and weren't causing any problem. They haven't been found in agriculture. They haven't been found causing anything in native wildlife. Again, they're just a food supply. And many entomologists do believe, yeah, they're just going to blend in with all the other tortoisids that we have, the 80 tortoisids that we have in California. And the same predators that act against the natives are going to act against LBAM. And actually, we've already shown that. We've shown that at a little pilot study at UCSC here, and the state has already done their own pilot studies showing that native wasps parasitize, to a large degree, LBAM larvae. So, you know, it's much to do about nothing. And just as an aside, I mean, to their credit, USDA does a tremendous amount of work to keep invasive species out that are of real significance, you know, or dealing with, you know, the state having to deal with things like West Nile, that's a disease vector, or whatever you feel about the justification. They do good work in some areas. This is a case where LBAM at one time probably was a problem back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s.
Where?
In Australia and New Zealand, when there was widespread use of organophosphates that would wipe out all of the beneficial predators in monocultures. And so that allows for these pests to abnormally come up because there's nothing to eat them. So they can just replicate and replicate and replicate without being held in check, and just by eating on whatever they can eat on. And they'll eat on anything they can find. But they only do superficial damage, but it's enough to keep them alive. Not enough to kill the plant, but enough to keep them alive. And without predators, they go unchecked. As soon as USDA required New Zealand to stop shipping produce that had organophosphate residues, New Zealand changed. They stopped using organophosphates. When they stopped using organophosphates, literally within a few years, the predator population started coming back to its normal levels, to where LBAM was no longer a pest whatsoever. What we learned is that the LBAM is not a pest whatsoever, because as the natural predators came back, that created the balance back in the ecosystem, so that you no longer needed to treat for LBAM separate from any other pest. You didn't have to single it out for treatment. Rarely, the people on the ground in New Zealand say that rarely do they have to ever treat for any superficial leaf roller whatsoever. They're dealing with other things, mealy bugs, codling moths, things that do real agricultural damage. And in doing that, they also kill the leaf roller complex, which includes LBAM. So everything that they're doing to manage other pests also control LBAM. Today, with modern agricultural management practices, they no longer really have to single out leaf rollers for treatment. If they do, they use what are called integrated growth regulators, and these are things that they actually put on the larva, and it causes them to mature faster, and then the skin breaks and they dehydrate and they die. But they never use pheromones for trying to eradicate species or even for mating disruption. They only use pheromones for monitoring to see if the population, starts to explode. That's the way pheromones should be used, not for trying to eradicate. I think the most important thing that any of us have to remember and take sincere and serious stock of is that that we have to protect ourselves against programs such as this. We can't rely on a benevolent government to do it, because there's just too great of an economic incentive to do things in a knee-jerk reaction, and that's what this was. This was a knee-jerk reaction to maintain trade equilibrium, to develop, have access to emergency funds that they wouldn't normally have access to, and to really railroad this into California residents. For California residents to be subjected to any type of aerial pesticide spraying is unconscionable. It shouldn't be done. It should never be done, especially with the weak justification that they have for this program. And we're the ones that are going to have to take control of that. They're not going to do it without our impetus.